Joining me now for more on this, Tom Corben, Research Fellow of Foreign Policy and Defence with the United States Study Centre. Thanks very much for your time. First of all, what do we make of the rumours, the speculation about what China might do here? Is it likely we're going to see them ramp up assistance and possibly militarily so?
Well, my read of Secretary Blinken's comments is that these are more of a warning to Beijing not to move on this if this is a real consideration. The Biden administration has had concerns for at least a year now about China's supply, whether through third parties or through state-owned enterprises of dual-use technology, so things like certain parts of fighter jets, radar technology, or jamming devices. But a step up to more direct, explicitly military or lethal forms of military aid would be a significant escalation of the type of aid that China is providing to Russia. And I think the Biden administration wants to make it pretty clear that doing so would bear some pretty significant consequences for the bilateral relationship with Washington.
And for China, so it's going to weigh that all up. If it's going to do this, is it just as simple as it hopes to weaken the West through this action, then anything it can do to achieve that is going to be something it proceeds with? Or do you think it will really have a bit of a pause of thought, particularly as well given it's been a staggeringly unsuccessful Russian invasion compared to what they wanted to achieve? Does China want to associate itself with it?
No, that's correct. Russia has underwhelmed, definitely from a Chinese perspective. As to what China's ulterior motives are here behind the various forms of support that it's providing Russia, whether it's material or diplomatic, I think there is a portion of that rationale that is about distracting the United States from honing its focus even more on the Asia Pacific, which is something that Biden administration officials have stressed throughout this war, that the Indo-Pacific remains a high priority. So from a Chinese perspective, aiding Russia in a way that prolongs the war, even if it doesn't resolve it, is a way of sapping US and Western attention, if not military resources at the same time.
I know there's been a lot of talk as well of, in some instances, just how much these countries, NATO countries and the US have left in terms of munitions. So, the more they use, I guess. Does that mean if China takes a step, which would be a pretty dramatic one, that would have us concerned about whether this is a strategic move and makes a China move on Taiwan more likely, as sort of a bit of a 1-2 move, if you like?
I don't think it's that simple. The line that a lot of analysis has drawn between the case of Ukraine and the potential case of Taiwan is kind of tenuous in some regards. They're not directly comparable. The kinds of military operations that will be required to launch offensives against either country are quite significantly different and require different kinds of capabilities and munitions. So in that sense, if China does decide to aid Russia with lethal aid, the kinds of resources that this is going to attract from the West in terms of its own military aid aren't necessarily the kinds of things that the West would seek to use in a conflict over Taiwan. But nevertheless, I really do think this is more about a strategic focus question. China is basically attempting to split the United States strategic focus between Europe and Asia. And to be honest, this is a problem that the United States has struggled with for some years, as work at the United States Study Centre has pointed out over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, well, and that was, all part of what turned out to be a pretty dramatic and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, that there's only so far US can stretch itself. So what about finally how the Russian invasion is going? Because the Ukrainian resistance has been stoic, and even the so-called winter offensive, so far, it hasn't really seemed to have borne a lot of fruit for Russia. Is that a fair synopsis, or is this still a bit of a meat grinder proposition?
It's a bit of column A and a bit of column B. So the winter offensive hasn't produced the kinds of gains that I'm sure the Russians would have liked to have seen. That partially has to do with the stoic Ukrainian resistance that we've seen throughout this war, but also because the winter in Europe this year was not nearly as harsh as many people predicted. As to whether this offensive is actually started, I tend to agree with analysts like Michael Kaufman that what we're actually seeing in terms of Russian operations right now is the offensive that people said was coming. I'm not necessarily sure, and again, I'm not a Russia expert here or kind of a conventional military land warfare expert. But I tend to agree with those experts that what we're seeing right now is more or less close to the high watermark of the Russian offensive that many people have said are coming. So in terms of what we can expect next, it's a bit of an open question, but I would tend to err on the side of caution and defer for a couple of weeks to a month to see exactly how this pans out before making any further judgments.